May 11th, 1995, the Los Angeles Convention Center. In the first ever Electronic Entertainment Expo, E3, SEGA was holding a press conference on their upcoming console called the SEGA Saturn. Announced 2 months beforehand, it was a 32-bit system meant to succeed the 16-bit Sega Genesis. In this conference room, President of SEGA of America Tom Kalinske made a surprise announcement that the SEGA Saturn would be available immediately. It will be on this day, May 11th, 1995, that SEGA, as a console manufacturer, died. Well, if I'm framing this as an unavoidable tragedy, I did need to use a bit of dramatic gravitas for our introduction. Right. Hi, I'm Jordan, and that's Wolf, time-traveling historians. Today, on a May 11th, 1995, was not the day that SEGA as a console manufacturer died. That day would be January 31st, 2001, when SEGA announced their exit from the console business and moved towards being a third-party developer. However, SEGA deciding to exit the console business was not because of the SEGA Dreamcast. While it itself was not the smash hit that SEGA needed to continue their console business, much of the blame had to do with its older sibling, the SEGA Saturn. It was a console that was the middle child of the Sega Genesis and Sega Dreamcast, and as such was the victim of corporate infighting and bad decisions that led to its failure and later discontinuation. Anyway, we'll be looking at the series of mistakes that led to the Sega Saturn being a complete dumpster fire, at least in North America, and how such a dumpster fire will be the final nail in the coffin for SEGA as a console manufacturer. SEGA, as a company when the Sega Saturn was being developed, can often be described as two different companies, SEGA of America and SEGA of Japan. Both had very different visions about what the future of the company should look like, and it all had to do with the older sibling of the Sega Saturn. No, not that one. Not that one. Not that one either. Yes, thanks, Wolf. The Sega Genesis had two very different stories in North America and Japan. In North America, the Sega Genesis debuted in 1988 but would not become extremely successful until the early 1990s, with a combination of an in-your-face marketing campaign and stellar titles such as Sonic the Hedgehog. But in its native homeland of Japan, the story of the Sega Genesis was different. In terms of the so-called console wars, it lagged behind its competitors, the SNES and TurboGrafx-16. Guys, wait up. I'm still relevant. So while it might seem ridiculous that Sega of Japan wanted to move on to newer hardware from someone in North America, it made sense from a domestic view. Why continue to support something that was third in console sales when you can begin development on a new, more competitive console? While I'll defend the reasoning of Sega of Japan to start development on what would become the Sega Saturn, I can't defend what was eventually created, which was, what's the word? Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. According to IGN, multiple sources describe the board initially sent to Sega of America for the Sega Saturn as a, quote, an elegant, overly complex jumble of mostly stock parts assembled on a large and expensive to manufacture board. Such a complicated board was likely due to the conflicting visions for the console. Initially, the Sega Saturn was meant as a 2D-based console before adding the ability for 3D-based titles due to threats from their competition with the then current 3DO and upcoming PlayStation. However, it still is a console that was rooted in two-dimensionality. As Scott Bayless, senior producer at Sega of America from 1990 to 1994, stated, quote, Saturn was essentially a 2D system with the ability to move the four corners of a sprite in a way that could simulate projection in 3D space. So, we have a mainly two-dimensional console with a complicated board that wasn't initially meant for three-dimensional titles and was added when the threats of the 3DO and PlayStation were apparent. This is an absolute disaster in terms of hardware development, for two reasons. One, you have a complicated board that is complicated. Those two words should never be in the same sentence together, mainly because it leads to the following. The more complicated your system is, the more difficult it is to develop for. The more difficult your system is to develop for, the less developers want to make titles for your system. Support from the console manufacturers would be critical to avoid catastrophe, and while Sega did create a support infrastructure for the Sega Saturn, Sony created better hardware and support that allowed for easier development of titles for the PlayStation. And when your competition is offering better hardware and support, who are you going to develop for? Second, the fact that the Sega Saturn was a 2D based system initially with 3D added later on in development is absolutely mind-boggling to me. I understand that maybe Sega didn't think that 3D was the future, but to add such capabilities so late into the console's development could not have been beneficial. If Sega wanted to make a 3-dimensional system, what should have happened was a complete overhaul of the board to make it a 3-dimensional system from the start, even if that meant short-term losses in the form of delays and cost. It's not like there were any attempts to fix the board, right? Yeah, I sometimes forget about those attempts because one of them sends me to an angry rant that lasts at least a minute. Regarding the collaboration with Silicon Graphics, they were working on a chipset designed for a gaming console. Sega of America was impressed, but when it came time to show Sega of Japan, they were not impressed. As Tom Kalinske recalls, quote, "The hardware guys came over and they really poo-pooed the whole effort. The chip was too big, there would be too much waste, lots of objections from a technical standpoint." And the conclusion to this failed collaboration is that Nintendo would eventually hire Silicon Graphics to make the hardware for the Nintendo 64, after Tom Kalinske suggested it to SGI founder Jim Clark. Out of the two collaborations, I do understand why this one was rejected. Sega Japan maybe had legitimate concerns about the chipset from Silicon Graphics and could have translated to serious issues with the Saturn. However, considering the issues that were already there with the Saturn, I'm not sure how many issues they would have had compared to what they did have. Furthermore, to my research, I can't find anything saying that the chipset caused headaches for developers on the Nintendo 64, only its usage of cartridges unlike the CD-based Saturn and Sony PlayStation. Speaking of the latter, it does lead into the second, and most frustrating, failed collaboration. The second collaboration floated was Sony, who worked with Sega on the Sega CD add-on for the Sega Genesis. Originally, Sony and Nintendo were collaborating on a CD add-on for the SNES, but the deal was abandoned in favor of a deal with Philips, which we all know turned out well and did not create any unfortunate side effects.
Gee, it sure is boring around here.
My boy.
Sony wanting to continue their work and Sega of America wanting a different board seems like a natural fit. Interviewed with fansite Sega 16, Tom Kalinske elaborated on how such a deal would have worked. Quote, "So our proposal was that each of us would sell this joint Sega-Sony hardware platform. We'll share the loss on the hardware, whatever that is, we'll split it, combine our advertising and marketing, but we'll each be responsible for the software sales we'll generate." Based on that information, this collaborative deal seems like it's fantastic for both companies. It would have allowed for Sega and Sony to mutually benefit from their strengths and improve their weaknesses. While Sony and Sega of America would be interested in the idea, it was once again rejected by Sega of Japan. You know what, folks? I have tried to be fair when it comes to understanding certain decisions that were made with the Sega Saturn, but this is absolutely ridiculous. I understand that hindsight is often 20/20 and that we're dealing with decisions with full hindsight, but even with this hindsight in mind, I can't comprehend why this collaboration didn't happen. According to Game Informer, the reason why was that Sega felt Sony wasn't serious about hardware development. If this reasoning is true, this is the worst reasoning I've ever seen. Sony wasn't a company that all of a sudden existed. It had experience making all sorts of tech like the Sony Walkman and Sony Betamax. and it worked with Sega before on the Sega CD. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The complex hardware and the failed attempts to remedy it are the reason why the Sega Saturn was doomed. But it might have had a chance to break out of its figurative coffin had the titles and marketing been excellent. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but instead served several final nails in the coffin for this thing. One of the first marketing blunders of the Sega Saturn had nothing to do with the console at all. Remember how I said before there was a disconnect in visions due to the different markets for the Sega Genesis in the United States and Japan? Well, that's why the Sega 32X exists. It was an add-on for the Sega Genesis, which allowed a 32-bit experience, kinda. Spurred by Sega of Japan, it was made to be a rapid response to systems such as the Atari Jaguar, which along with the 3DO made companies like Sega nervous about their comparatively less technologically impressive systems. Now I know that with hindsight that seems like a laughable thing considering the failure of both consoles, but that's how it was. So, I know what my audience is thinking. Why is Sega making an add-on for the Sega Genesis when the Sega Saturn was on the horizon? Well, at the time, it wasn't. There was uncertainty when the Sega Saturn would be on the horizon, but then it was on the horizon when the Sega Saturn was announced to be launching in November 1994 in Japan. It evaporated the necessity of the Sega 32X when a brand new system was on the way, which it also didn't help the Sega 32X had rushed and inexpensive software, further sealing its fate as a failure. What does any of this really have to do with the Sega Saturn? One, I would argue that it took valuable time and resources that Sega could have been committing to the Sega Saturn. Two, it created an environment of damaged trust between consumers and Sega. As Scott Bayless stated, quote, US and EU consumers immediately started asking the obvious question: why should I buy 32X when Saturn is only a few months away? Sadly, the best answer Sega could come up with was that 32X was a transitional device that would form a bridge from Mega Drive to Saturn. Frankly, it just made us look greedy and dumb to consumers, something that a year earlier I couldn't have imagined people thinking about us. We were the cool kids. Now, I'd argue that the Sega 32X was not the sole cause of eroding trust between Sega and consumers. Nintendo did release failures during the 1990s, such as the Virtual Boy, and didn't suffer enormous damage in trust for it. Rather, it was because it was the second in a series of failures for Sega, the first one being the Sega CD. With two failures chipping away consumers' trust in Sega as a console manufacturer, the actual marketing for the Sega Saturn needed to convince consumers that it was not one of those prior failures. Unfortunately, you might have noticed on the title of this video, I have an asterisk on why the Sega Saturn was a dumpster fire. I include that because I'm mainly focusing on the Sega Saturn in North America, because when launched on November 22nd, 1994 in Japan, it was a success, which seems like an oxymoron. How could the Sega Saturn then bomb its launch in North America? Well, how about being released earlier than expected, and not telling anyone about it? Yeah, that's a surefire way of dooming your complicated console. Why? Well, Sega of Japan was nervous about the looming launch of the Sony PlayStation in North America. So, in an effort to stop their competition, on May 11th, 1995 at E3, Sega of America was forced to announce that the Sega Saturn would be launched earlier than its scheduled release in autumn 1995. It launched that day. It was an unmitigated disaster for everyone involved. While such an announcement can easily work in a digital age of social media, in 1995 this was non-existent, and would have needed an insane amount of planning and communication from Sega. Unfortunately, this did not happen, which led to consumers, developers, and retailers not being informed about the choice and suffering negative consequences. Sony, meanwhile, absolutely hammered Sega with the announcement of the Sony PlayStation being $299, $100 less than the Sega Saturn. So, all in all, the event was a complete failure, and any element of surprise was ruined by a lack of communication and coordination. But such bad marketing extended to the average commercials and magazine advertisements for the Sega Saturn. Like, seriously, look at these advertisements. What the heck am I supposed to be feeling in these commercials? Because all I feel is weirdness and shame. It doesn't want to make me buy a Sega Saturn, that's for sure. To make matters even worse for Sega, there would never be any mainline Sonic the Hedgehog title either on launch or ever in the existence of the Sega Saturn. Sonic the Hedgehog was Sega's mascot character, and while attempts at a title called Sonic Extreme were made, the development was so horrendous and it ended up being cancelled in 1997. There were spin-offs / ports in the form of Sonic 3D, Flicky's Island, Sonic R, and Sonic Jam. That's it. That's like Nintendo releasing the Nintendo 64 and not having any mainline Mario titles for it. And to add one last cherry on top for this figurative crap cake, Sega of America would announce in little less than 3 years, in March 1998, that the Sega Saturn would be discontinued in North America. Now, I want you to imagine yourself as a consumer during this time. You bought a Sega Saturn when it launched in 1995, meaning it cost you $399 or $677.25 in 2020. Then, Sega announces less than 3 years later that the expensive console you bought is now being discontinued. While I understand that life cycles for consoles aren't necessarily standardized, that still is a short amount of time on the market and consumers weren't likely happy. It didn't matter what the Sega Dreamcast was, consumers now have been burnt out on 3 failures when it came to Sega: the Sega CD, the Sega 32X, and now the Sega Saturn. I understand the significance and ahead of its time nature of the Sega Dreamcast, but it was ultimately a mistake. Sega should not have made a new console, and by doing so eroded any trust left in both consumers and developers. And the subsequent failure of that console, coupled with the financial situation of Sega at the time, led to their discontinuation as a console manufacturer in 2001. In a sense, Sega is what killed Sega. It wasn't because of competitors like Nintendo, Microsoft, or Sony. It wasn't because of the Sega Dreamcast, necessarily. It was ultimately because Sega made the Sega Saturn. Without the Saturn, I think Sega would have had a better chance continuing their hardware business in the 21st century. It could have also been done had the Sega Saturn not suffered from corporate infighting, hardware issues, a disastrous marketing campaign, and cutting its life too short in North America. None of these decisions could have been avoided, however, almost like a tragedy where one could watch the event unfold but their outcome was unavoidable. That's a different conclusion than I thought I would say before I started researching for this video, where I had hoped to discover the mistakes of the Saturn and how they could have been avoided. But we can't. Not without a ton of 2020 hindsight and fixing core issues. And that's against the time travel police of the Russian Empire, and gosh knows I don't want to deal with them today. Yeah, but nowhere in those rules did it say we couldn't purchase items from those realities. Alright, now I don't have to go on an online auction site to get my hands on one of these bad boys. On the antique shelf you go. Anyway, that's the story of how the Sega Saturn was a complete dumpster fire in North America. I hope you enjoyed our little time traveling adventure, which is sure not to have any consequences whatsoever.